My name is Elif Shafak, and this is one of the series of debates that I will be curating this year at Edinburgh Book Festival. And when Nick Barley and his fabulous team asked me to be a guest selector this year, I felt a guest curator. I felt very, very honored. And afterwards, we had lots of discussions, brainstorming, talking about what are the issues that we want to raise, that we want to share with the audiences, explore. And we always came back to this question of there's so much happening in the world today, and we're living in such liquid times of uncertainty. And there's so much anxiety, anger, fear in the air, everywhere you go, east and west. And what happened in Barcelona yesterday, this heartbreaking, horrific, the cruelty of the attacks, we've seen in Manchester, London, Berlin, Istanbul, Baghdad, Nice, Paris. And I think at times like this, when there's so much is happening so fast, we need new narratives. We need people who give us hope, who give us vision, and who bring a better approach, an approach that depends on not only the mind, but also the heart and conscience. And I frankly think we need more women to express their opinions. So I feel very, very privileged, very honored to share the stage with two such women who give us hope, who give us vision, who come with a new narrative. I think this is a time when women need to talk louder and bolder. And we're going to do things a little bit differently. It's not going to be like one of us asking questions to the others. We will be free to ask questions to each other, to comment on each other's words. And we're also very much looking forward to your questions at the end, your comments, your critical remarks. Of course, Nicola Sturgeon needs no introduction. The First Minister of Scotland, a worldwide public figure, but I think we should also emphasize that her very presence, very existence as a successful politician sends a very strong message to women and young girls, not only in this country, but beyond the borders of this country. So I think it's very important that we have successful, high-level female politicians, decision makers, speaking in the public space. That message, especially for young girls, I find very, very crucial. Heather McDaid, whom I have met, before I've met personally, I've met her through her work. This amazing, wonderful, very timely, very bold, playful at the same time, diverse anthology of women's voices, Nasty Women, which she edited with Laura Jones. And I admired both the courage in that book, but also the honesty, saying this is who we are, we're here, and we have lots to say to the world. But before we kick off, I have a little confession to make, if I may. I need to get it out of my chest. I have led a very nomadic life since my childhood, and I have been asked several times, did you ever have a culture shock when you went to a country, a new city? And I always said, no, I didn't, I really didn't have a culture shock. I don't remember such an experience. But today I am having a massive, massive culture shock. Because this morning I woke up and I said to myself, my God, I'm going to be on a panel with Nicola Sturgeon, Heather McDaid, and we're going to talk about books. We're going to talk about women's rights. We're going to talk about feminism, the state of the world. You see, I'm not used to such things. I come from a country in which political leaders don't talk about such things. I come from a country, from a land where political leaders do not read books. They don't talk about novels. They do not endorse women's rights. And in fact, they do the opposite. And they certainly do not endorse LGBT rights. And they certainly do not say, I'm very proud to take part in the Pride March. I will be participating. So I think I am going through that culture shock. And I want to start with that question, if I may. How difficult is it to be an unconventional politician in a world like politics?
Well, to start with, the positive, I guess, the encouraging thing is the kind of approach to politics and to public life that you've just described is thankfully in this country becoming less unconventional. Thankfully, we now have leaders, and I will say this openly, across the political spectrum who not just endorse women's rights but actively campaign for women's rights. I'm very proud we are now one of the many countries in the world that celebrates the fact that we have equal marriage. And tomorrow I will take part in the Pride March in Glasgow. We have, across the political spectrum, politicians who are much more willing now to challenge intolerance and prejudice and to speak out against, for example, what we've seen in the United States over the past few days. So that's the positive, and I think we should celebrate that. And that applies to women and to men in politics. I suppose the less positive is we've still got a long way to go. I think we need more voices challenging prejudice and intolerance and bigotry. I still think for all the progress we've made for women and equal rights for women, we've still got such a long way to go. We now have a situation where, in theory, in this country, women can do pretty much anything. But in practice, that's still not the case, because we've got ingrained attitudes and systemic institutional barriers to women achieving all the same things and pursuing all the same dreams as men. So I'm a politician. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I'm some kind of paragon of virtuous politician, because that doesn't exist. I indulge in the same behaviours as many other politicians. We're susceptible to spinning things from time to time. But I've always tried, not always succeeded, I hasten to add, but I've always tried to speak from the heart and to say things that I believe in. I couldn't, no matter how much diplomatic turbulence it may cause, I could not have made myself stay silent this week in the face of Donald Trump's comments in the United States, and I just couldn't do that. So, speak from the heart and stand up for what you believe in. And I just take the view in politics, if you're not prepared to try to do that, accepting that at times you will fail, we're human and politics is politics, but if you're not prepared to have that as the principle by which you try to live your lives, then don't be in politics, go and do something else.
Yeah. Heather, we mentioned Trump. It's almost inevitable not to mention his response, or his lack of response after Charlottesville, of course, was very problematic, and I fully agree. I admired your comment when you said there are things that are too fundamental, for diplomatic silence. And when I look at the way you triggered the publishing, especially the publishing of this book, would you tell us a little bit about that, the whole journey? Because there is a journey behind it, and one of the things I admire about that journey is you brought in so many people. It was supported by so many readers from the civil society. Will you tell us a little bit about that? And why now? Why did you feel the need to publish such a book right now?
Yeah, so we published Nasty Women, which is an essay collection on what it is to be a woman in the 21st century. And the idea came around the day after Trump was elected. To watch someone run on such a misogynistic, racist and generally hateful campaign was horrible, but to watch him win, like the next morning, everyone was kind of deflated and no one really knew what to do. And Laura and myself, we had this idea, and we just thought this could be a way to take something that he said and give a platform to the kind of people that he's trying to silence. And we just had the idea and we had to run with it. We put it on Kickstarter, and we were looking for £6,000, and within 2.5 days it was funded. And by the end of the month, we had £22,000 with support of Margaret Atwood, which still feels a bit weird to say. Yeah. But yeah. But I think the reason it went so well is because it struck a nerve. What do you do with someone like Trump? And for me and Laura, we're just two women in a spare room, and for us it was making a book and giving a platform to other people. And for other people, it was backing this book and actually almost validifying the fact that this platform was needed. So I think that's why it went so well, because with something as all-consuming as Trump, where do you even begin? And if the beginning is reading other people's stories and going, I'm not going to kind of support this, that was our idea and our starting point for it.
Mm-hmm. I remember years ago when I was living in Istanbul, a well-known scholar came to visit Istanbul from America, and she said to me, it's very understandable that you're a feminist because you're Turkish. And I found that statement so problematic, as if you can be a feminist if you're living in certain parts of the world, because those parts of the world have issues with gender equality. But we in some other parts of the world, we're so over these concerns. And I think in some ways maybe Trump and lots of other populist demagogues have opened up a new awareness. Maybe there's more of us right now who is aware of the fact that the rights we take for granted can be taken away, that nations can go backwards, and this is the right time for maybe global feminism, global activism. But I also want to ask, what do you think we should do differently? You know, what are the things we were not able, as feminists, as people who believe in gender equality, is there anything that we should be doing differently right now at this stage in time?
I think I would say two things. Firstly, and I feel this is, you know, a woman in a, you know, Western democracy where there can often be a sense that, you know, we're over that, you know, the battle for women's equality has been won, so why do we need to still be having these arguments? I think we need to reach out much more and to draw the connections between the women here in Edinburgh and the women in Istanbul. You know, at a very practical day-to-day level, those challenges are very, very different, but they have their roots in the same issues. So I think much more global solidarity and global dialogue would be the first thing. Second thing, and I speak, I suppose, very much from the perspective of Scotland and the UK here, and it will be true in other countries like us. I think we have to, and this is why Heather's work is so hugely important, reach across the generations and the genders.
Yeah.
I had a conversation with a young man a couple of weeks ago, 19 years old, you know, lovely young man. I'm not going to say who he is, but it's a young man I'm very fond of. It's somebody I know very well, and, you know, very progressive, liberal attitudes and everything else, and had a conversation with him about feminism. And he articulated to me his view of feminism from the perspective of a young man growing up today. And his view was very much that, well, women have equal rights, and sometimes it now feels to me as a young man that feminism is about, you know, trying to undermine my rights. Yeah. Now, you know, that's just not how, but if that was coming to me from him as a young man today, then that says we've still got a lot of work to do, and we've probably got to think about how we do that now across the generations and the genders, even here at home. So those would be the two things. Whether it involves doing things differently, I'm not sure, but the things that I would think we need to think about afresh today.
Absolutely. I think you had a similar concern, because when I look at the anthology, the diversity of voices, how did you choose the people who wrote for this book?
We were kind of aware that there's been a lot of collections, and there's a risk of it being an echo chamber if you just have the same people talking about the same kind of things. So we had an open call for submissions. So we had a mix, just people kind of flooded us with submissions, and we were trying to get a big range of voices, because as you said, people need to experience other people's lives. And I think there's a quote, it's something like, when you've had privilege, equality feels like you're having something taken away from you. And that's what we want to do, is actually show why people still need equality. Is going, Laura and myself are aware that we're two fairly privileged white women, so we were like, ironic as I sit with a microphone in front of a crowd, but it wasn't like about our story. But like, yeah. And we actually wanted to find people, even though we commissioned it, we learned a lot along the way, and we're like, if we can learn and we're actually actively seeking it, then imagine what this can do for someone who this is their first kind of glimpse at feminism. So that's what we hope to do, because echo chambers benefit no one on either side.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's probably going to be one of our biggest challenges. How do we speak to people who are not necessarily part of our own echo chamber? But I was reading your statements about Chechnya and the persecution of sexual minorities. And these are very, very difficult issues for many political leaders. They don't, not only political leaders, I think many people who have global messages, global ties, they don't want to talk about these issues, such as human rights, freedom of speech, in the name of not upsetting. And I admire the fact that you were able to do that. There's a part of me that very strongly believes women's rights movement needs to go hand in hand with LGBT rights. We're all in this together. And in countries like Turkey, that's the connection that we have lost. And very sadly, sometimes women can take part in the perpetuation of these gender codes. How do we deal with that? I mean, how do we deal with the values that we internalize? It's one thing when somebody tells you you can't, you don't have an equal voice, but it's quite another thing, and maybe much more difficult to dismantle when we ourselves put that kind of pressure on ourselves. I'm just curious, do you catch yourself doing that? To yourself, judging yourself through a more male filter. Yeah.
Well, it probably in the last few years, actually, I've become conscious of, the way I behaved when I was a much younger woman in politics, and looking back on it, as a young woman in politics, even more so than is the case today, I would be surrounded most of the time by, no offence to anybody in this audience who's about to fall into the category I'm going to describe, middle-aged white men. And unconsciously and unknowingly at the time, I started to, behave in a way that was about conforming and fitting into the people I was surrounded by. And that was reflected, I guess, in how I chose to dress as a young woman in politics, how I behaved. And in politics, that means if you're trying to fit into how the men around you are behaving, then that means you become, adversarial and, dare I say it, aggressive in how you pursue and articulate your arguments as the men around you do. But here's the real nub, and here's the trap for women. You find yourself emulating the traits that in men are seen as strengths. Mm-hmm. But then you quickly realise in women these things are not seen as strengths. So the male politician who's very assertive and aggressive and adversarial is a great, strong leader. Yeah. A woman is bossy and strident. A nippy sweetie is what they used to call me. And, So you quickly realise that you're in this double bind. In order to be taken seriously, you think you have to behave like the majority around you, which happens to be men, but you're actually undermining, as you do that, how you are perceived. And if you ask me, and to sum up a very complex question, how will I, as a woman in and obviously my experience is politics, but this will apply across a range of different fields, how will we know that we have succeeded in some of these battles are behind? Now, there's lots of practical ways that we will have to judge that, but above all, it's when women can succeed by being themselves, not by trying to be somebody else or conform, because we're all different. No two women are the same. So when we concede by just being ourselves and playing to our strengths and acknowledging our own weaknesses, and I don't quite think we're there yet.
We're not there yet. But what about the younger generation? Does it affect younger people in the same way?
I think it can be more basic things. So I know as a teenager, and a lot of my friends were the same, we considered ourselves like one of the guys, and we would go watch sport and we'd act, and we'd not be like other girls. And actually, that seems quite a flippant thing, but the kind of undertone of that is that certain types of women you don't want to be like. And actually, when I started working in publishing, there's an all-women Facebook group, and actually having such a supportive group of women, you don't realise the difference of actually going, you can act like a guy, you can like sport, whatever, but actually you don't realise how supportive that is until you've got it, because I think there's a lot of it's just more day to day. You don't realise that flippancy, the actual undertones can be a kind of almost anti-feminist thing of going, I'm not like them, but then what does that actually mean that they are? It's kind of, I don't really know how to answer that, but I know like once you become aware of it, you start to see it everywhere and try like teach like nieces and all that, don't do that, be who you want, don't like change it. But I don't know how you actually get that to people who aren't aware that they're doing that.
I think it's very important to talk about these issues, because there's so many things we do unknowingly without being aware of it. We internalize so much. I mean, I look at, particularly in much more patriarchal, sexist countries, and Turkey is one of them. I look at the women, the very few women who can exist in the public space have to defeminize themselves, desexualize themselves because we associate lots of things with weakness. Even colors, wearing, more colors we associate with weakness. And I catch myself doing that all the time. Over the years, I was never able to wear colorful dresses. My children always make fun of my wardrobe. They open it and they say black, 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 gray, black, black, gray. Why is it like that? And I spent my childhood in Spain. I would admire Spanish women who were so at peace, in their bodies with their dresses.
Scottish women are not quite like that yet.
Why not? So these things are very slow to change.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
It's fascinating. You come from the very patriarchal society you talk about, where I guess I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, that women's rights are not anywhere near as advanced as they are here. But yet you have multiple challenges. You're also a writer that has challenged the establishment and the system. You went through a period of fearing imprisonment because of what you were writing being seen as anti-Turkish. So we talk here as women about having to deal with the continued battle for women's equality, but in Turkey you're not just battling for that, you're battling for free speech and the ability to express yourself. How do you cope with all of that and kind of make a sort of coherent sense of it?
Yeah, thank you. I often feel like being a Turkish writer, it's a bit like being slapped on one cheek and being kissed on the other cheek at the same time, because from the readers you get such a warm, positive, inspiring energy. And I'm saying this because ironically in countries like Turkey where there is no freedom of speech, perhaps books matter even more. And books do not evaporate as fast. And the book is not a personal item. You read it and you pass it on, and then that person passes it on. And that's amazing to see how one single copy is shared by at least 6 or 7 different people. So that's very precious for me. But the other side is incredibly suffocating, because people don't understand that art needs imagination needs freedom of speech. They don't understand all of these things, and politics very much dominates everything. When I first came to the UK, it's been more than 7 years now, I remember, maybe it wasn't around that time, a bit later, Hilary Mantel, in one of her interviews, she made some critical remarks about either the monarchy, and I remember feeling paralyzed, thinking, what's going to happen to her now? Is she going to be sued? Is she going to be put on trial?
Just the front page of the Daily Mail, probably. Perhaps worse.
Because we have in Turkey this Article 301, which protects Turkishness against insults, even though nobody knows what that means. It's so vague. So whereas what happened here is, of course, she got all kinds of criticism, remarks, positive and negative, but that's about it. So what I'm trying to say is we're dealing with a very different environment in Turkey, and I think women find it much harder because patriarchal societies, and I think they're all connected, as nationalism increases, authoritarianism increases, Islamism increases, sexism and misogyny also increase. They go hand in hand. And I think it's difficult for women, of course, but much more difficult for younger women. Maybe age helps in that regard, because patriarchal societies respect matriarchs, it's at least in the private space. But for younger women, the challenge is enormous. I don't know how you feel about when you observe the changes in the world. There are people who are saying we have made so much progress, and many others are saying the progress is in fact so limited.
Yeah, I think. For some people, obviously, changes will happen, but that's kind of what we wanted to do with the book, was actually, for example, Trump made the joke, apparently, about the Muslim ban when he was campaigning, and actually people were like joking to some people we know, going, oh, Trump's going to ban you from the country. And actually one of the essays by Ziba Tokani writes about that as being a Muslim woman and a lot of stuff that she's experienced living across the world. And as she was editing it, he tried to put the Muslim ban into place, and actually from the outside a lot of people were just like, that's fine, that's not actually going to happen. But we were like, no, what's the actual reality of someone who lives with this stuff? So I don't necessarily know. I think it all just comes back to hearing from the people who are on the receiving end of that stuff and trying to understand where they're coming from and also fight for their corner. Because I think the other thing is we can all say stuff's changing, but we can all just also sit and do nothing as well. So I don't really know.
I think one of the things that we're perhaps all, or here, we're waking up to now, is that we've taken for granted that certain certain progress that we've made over recent years is forever, that it can never regress. And I think, here with Brexit, Trump, some of what's happening across the world generally, I think we're now realising that you can make as much progress on women's rights, on anti-racism, on LGBTI rights, but something can happen and somebody can come along and push that backwards. So you always have to be making the case over and over again, and that on one hand is quite depressing, very depressing, but on the other hand I suppose it's an opportunity for us to restate and reaffirm for a new generation why these rights matter, and the intersections of them all are really important. At the end of the day, what are women battling against, or Muslims in some countries, or gay people? It's the battling against the perpetuation by an establishment of the world as they want it to be. And the sort of famous Hillary Clinton speech at Beijing, women's rights are human rights, and I think that connection is so important for us to hang on to.
And we did become more passionate about politics, didn't we? More emotional.
We certainly have in Scotland, yes.
Which can be good and bad. It can go in both ways. But I want to ask maybe a tricky question, if I may. Coming from Turkey, seeing the experiences there, not only in Turkey, across the Middle East, the Balkans, for us, for instance, the word nationalism is, for me personally, has a very negative meaning, because I've seen how ugly it can get, how destructive it can become, how violent it can become, and how it can divide people into imaginary categories. And make them lose that culture of coexistence. Whereas when I come here, I hear the word nationalism being used in a different way. And I doubt that. Can nationalism ever be benign? Can it ever be a benevolent thing? So there's a part of me that doubts that very much. And I want to ask, because we care about words, all of us.
The word is difficult. I mean, we were chatting earlier on, and can I preface my answer here by recognising there'll be people in this audience who support Scottish independence, people who passionately oppose Scottish independence. Who knows, there might even be some people who don't have an opinion, although that is perhaps less likely. I was chatting to Elif earlier on and saying, if I could turn the clock back, 90 years to the establishment of my party and choose its name all over again, I wouldn't choose the name it's got just now. I would call it something other than the Scottish National Party. Now, people say, why don't you change its name now? And it's like, well, that would be far too complicated, because what those of us who do support Scottish independence are all about could not be further removed from some of what you would recognise as nationalism in other parts of the world. I mean, I believe, for example, two things that I believe that I think run so strongly through the Scottish independence movement are, firstly, that it doesn't matter where you come from. If Scotland is your home and you live here and you feel you have a stake in the country, you are Scottish and you have as much say over the future of the country as I do. And that is a civic, open, inclusive view of the world that is so far removed from what you would rightly fear. But secondly, one of the great motivators for those of us who support Scottish independence is wanting to have a bigger voice in the world. It's about being outward-looking and internationalist, not inward-looking and insular. So the word is hugely problematic sometimes for those of us who, Scottish independence is about self-government. It's about running your own affairs and making your own mark in the world. So words do matter. But I think we can't change the connotations that the word has in other parts of the world. What we have to do is just demonstrate through words of our own, through deeds, through actions, through how we carry ourselves, that we stand for something completely different to all of that.
Yeah. Heather, words do matter, and there's a word you want to reclaim. There's a phrase, actually, nasty woman.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? I think about this a lot. When I look at the Turkish dictionary, the official Turkish dictionary, there's so many problematic definitions. On the one hand, we respect freedom of speech. There's a part of me that wants to get rid of those very, very problematic definitions which are very misogynistic. Beyond the phrase nasty women, do you think, how do you think we should approach all these pejorative words, misogynistic words? Shall we just maybe try to ignore them or to recover them, redefine them? What should be our approach?
I think, well, just with reference to nasty women, I know as soon as he said it, it was slapped on like a lot of cups and badges, which is good and whatever. But like we wanted to actually give nasty women to people affected and let them give their own definition to it rather than just reclaim the term by putting it on merchandise. And I think that's a good way to do it if there's a valid project. I'm fairly certain there's going to be one called Nevertheless She Persisted, and it's going to be equally is like good, because I think you can take those terms and if you do something, I think the thing is handing it over to people and letting them self-define what it is to be a nasty woman. For other terms, I think it's for the person that it impacts to decide. So yeah, if someone wants to ignore it and that gives them more power to ignore it, or if they want to reclaim it and take the power themselves, I think it's more of a case by case on how to deal with what words mean and how they impact people.
And you have been supported a lot by, social media, right? So you have a more positive experience of the social media. May I say it that way?
Mostly positive.
Mostly positive.
What do you think? I'm always interested because I've got very firm positive and negative
yeah, we've seen
social
both
media.
sides. Yeah.
What as a younger woman, do you? Because one of the things I think is while we've made lots of progress, and some of the more formal kind of parts of misogyny and sexism have been banished or at least less out in the open, social media actually makes life much more difficult for women because it allows those attitudes, while they might be a minority, to get to you much more directly. Do you think it's good or bad for younger women that's we've got the internet and social media?
I think it's good because you get a platform to actually do this kind of thing. Just with Nasty Women, a group of neo-Nazis in America found out about the book and started sending us graphic photos of mutilated women in response to us doing exactly right. And we're literally two women in Scotland who have nothing to do with them apart from this tenuous link to Trump. So actually, if you're a young woman and you want to speak out, I can only imagine what your Twitter feed is like half the time. Like when you have something to say, like you're just endlessly shouting it down. So I think, like you said, there's a lot of positives, but the actual backlash to I think in general, women speaking and kind of confidently owning their space is quite political at times for some people. And to do it online, you just open to floodgates, and you have to have some resilience to actually keep doing it.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I tend to think it's a bit like the moon, it has a definitely bright side and the dark side as well, and it's better to be aware of both sides of the internet. The slander, misinformation is going to be a big problem for all of us. How the truth is being distorted, hate speech, how that expands. But on the other hand, across the Middle East, I look at people, because for us, Facebook and Twitter, they're not necessarily platforms where you talk about more personal issues. They're also political platforms if you don't have freedom of speech in the public space. So they're politicized much more. And there are many more women who can't find a space outside their houses, but on the internet they find a voice. So it gives them an additional zone of existence which we can't ignore either. But the dark side is also going to become quite problematic for all of us. I wonder what you think about this, the loss of truth, how easily it's being distorted.
Yeah.
How do we fight against this?
It's difficult. I mean, on the one hand, I agree with Heather. As a politician, social media is hugely empowering.
Yeah.
And suddenly you can challenge things directly that previously you would have been unable to. You can get a message across instantaneously that would have been much more difficult. So on one level, it's very empowering, as it is for the public. It kind of democratises the whole public debate, but it gives people, previously if somebody wanted to send a death threat or a rape threat or just pure abuse to a politician, you'd have to write a letter and put it in an envelope and put a stamp on it and go and post it. And most of these people don't leave their bedrooms in their mother's house, so it's kind of difficult for them to do. But now they can press a button and it's right with you. And I think that's not just a problem for women, but I think for women and for younger women that's particularly challenging. The whole truth, I have to say, when I watched Trump the other night, and was appalled, as most people were. But, you know, there is a little bit of kind of envy as he shouted, you know, wheeshed fake news. Let me finish. I have fantasies about doing that at a press conference with the media here. For journalists in the room, I'm only joking. But I think it is really difficult because, you know, people believe what they read online almost as a kind of articles of faith, and it's a good way in terms of good if you're putting across as a way of putting across reliable information. But how do people judge online what's true and what's not? And so people are putting their faith in information. You know, people read something on Facebook, they almost take for granted that it must be true because they read it on Facebook, and that's before we get into some of the sinister forces, manipulating the internet. So what is, I think, on the whole, a fantastic innovation is fraught with lots and lots of challenges for us.
Absolutely. It's kind of painful. Like, my background's in journalism, and it's kind of painful to see, like, Trump will tweet at like 3 a.m. some ridiculous thing which isn't true, and then but people will go, but they don't trust the press, and you're like, it's really hard to navigate that whole, just because someone's got like 30 million followers, what they say isn't necessarily true, but it's got the platform that you can't get otherwise, and it's trying to find ways to like assimilate the kind of counter, well, this is what's actually happening. Because I think as well, so much is happening, by the time you can actually drill into the details of the latest thing he said something else, so it's moved on too quickly to actually scrutinise it, to actually go, well, that thing he tweeted is not true, but by the time you got the facts, there's like 10 more things that you're supposed to counter through all the noise on social media.
Actually, we had a deal beforehand. I told Elif that somebody, camera would probably be in front of the clock.
I'm just checking.
How well used is social, you know, in Turkey, for example, how many people use Twitter and Facebook? Is it
It's a
universal?
bit tricky. I mean, many people do use, although there's a big chunk of the population that doesn't have any access to the internet. We should not forget that either. But like Brazil, like several other countries, India, Turkey is a big expanding market, particularly when it comes to social media. It became more politicized over the years, but now it's tightly regulated. Some of you might or might not know this, that Wikipedia is banned right now. So my worry is in Russia, in China, in Turkey, in many other countries, we're seeing this alternative online environments. They're creating their own environments so that people can only get their information from those filtered sources. And that is tearing us apart even more. So those gaps, cognitive gaps, cultural gaps, are going to be very, very problematic because people need to hear these voices. That's why I find it very important that we keep in touch with the civil societies. We might be very critical of the governments, the politics, the politicians of a certain country, and I think we should be, of many countries, but not to isolate the people, not to forget the people. It's very important that we remain connected to women, young people, minorities, because they're there and they need that connection. Shall we slowly open the floor for questions from the audience? We're very much looking forward to that, yeah. And there's already one there. And I think we have a roving mic. We also want more women to ask questions. Hand up there? Can't see very well.
Hi
Do we have
guys.
a microphone?
Sorry. What?
Okay,
It's over here.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi guys. A great talk. I'm finding that you're articulating a whole lot of stuff that I've been feeling for years. Like, it's really good to hear it in a public space. I'm asking in honor of my flatmate who couldn't be here. She's doing a PhD on women in nationalist movements, and I was wondering if, for all three of you, do you think that nationalist movements can work in tandem with and benefit women's rights? And, like, maybe what that would look like?
I think we may run straight into the problem we were talking about earlier on, that what I would, the nationalist movement I'm part of, absolutely, and I hope we demonstrate that in what we do. I guess the kind of nationalist movements that Elif is more familiar with, and the ones we see elsewhere in the world, I would challenge that, because I think part of what they're about is denigrating women and suppressing those kind of rights. So I think we immediately run into a terminology issue here.
Yeah, there's a terminology issue. Also, in the short run, they seem to be, in several parts of the world, we've seen examples of that. They might endorse women's participation and maybe give them more voice. But I believe in the longer run it's quite problematic, because every nationalistic ideology teaches us tribalism. It tells us that we all belong in tribes. And it tells us that we will be safer or better, more comfortable if we're surrounded by sameness. And there's a part of me that does not like that. I think we benefit from diversity, from cosmopolitanism. I know it's very challenging, but I honestly think if we're ever going to learn anything in this life, we will learn from people who are different than us, not exactly like us. So that emphasis on sameness and tribes is something that I find quite problematic. There was one question here, yeah. Do we have the microphone? Yeah, here, please.
Hi. How important have networks of women been to each of you in your careers?
I mean, well, I know you're part of the female Facebook group I was talking about, so very. No, I think it has been supportive, because originally, so something like Nasty Women, we decided between that it published on International Women's Day, so it was a 4-month turnaround, which is insane. But actually, we had this supportive group of women, and we immediately said, we're going to do this project. Could you recommend people? Could you put us in touch with stuff? And I feel like if we'd have done this book a year ago, we couldn't have done it. And actually, it's been a total game changer. And the other thing is, when something happens or you do kind of hit a barrier, or having a place like that where you can talk to people and actually go, is this right? How do I deal with this? What would you do? Has been like a complete game changer for us.
Hugely important to me, right throughout my career, having other women to talk to and learn from and share experiences with has been hugely important. In my earlier days in politics, that tended to be quite a small group, because there weren't that many women in politics, more now. And one of the things I'm really passionate about is using my experience, such as it is now, and sharing that with other women. So, I've just selected a young woman that I'm going to mentor for a year. That's one of many ways of trying to do that. But, I think women supporting other women is really important. And one of the things, and I always hesitate before saying this because it kind of goes down in varying ways, but often women are our worst enemies. Other women can be our worst enemies sometimes, in terms of we are each other's biggest critics, occasionally. And I think we need to find more ways of supporting each other rather than rushing to bring each other down.
Yeah.
I think this gentleman's not going to give up the microphone until we take his question. I would say typical man, but that would be not fair.
Well, it is unfair, but that's you at the moment. Thank you very much. And I left middle-aged 20 years ago. So, no thank you for that either.
Can I redeem myself by saying you don't look as if you left middle-aged?
Flattery will get you everywhere. Ladies, it's very easy for you and I to throw our hands up in horror at the antics of Donald Trump. First of all, I would say he's the president, leader of the most powerful nation in the world. And there's no doubt that in his own homeland, he got the votes that made him so. Well, no, that's into the territory of misuse and fake news, I feel. And I'll stick with the fact that he is the leader of America. And just remind Nicola maybe of his Scottish ancestry.
Thanks for
his
that.
mother. Oh, now.
Do we have a question, sir? Do you have a question?
Right, the question really is, and thank you for your patience, I'm transporting you to Middle America, and you're in the middle of Trump territory, all three of you. Now tell me what you would actually do. Not words, please, but that's the only way we can cover it today. But actually do.
One of the essays in Nasty Women is by Elise Hines, and it's called Adventures of a Half-Black Yank in America. And she writes about living in South Carolina and the stuff that she is having to deal with, having grown up in New York in one of the most diverse kind of boroughs in the entire country, to then move to somewhere that is completely Trump's place. And actually, I think in our case, we would probably do the same thing, because in this book we try to seek people who are living under Trump and not just have the view from the other side of the ocean looking and going, oh, what a terrible thing. We actually wanted to find people living under him, and we have a few women of colour who write about what it's like. Not even, some of it was before he was president, it was kind of the atmosphere of his election and his campaign and what that did. So I think from our end, we would probably still do the same thing, which is find women who aren't traditionally being heard and try and empower their voices, because at the end of the day, you don't really hear about the everyday women living under Trump. You hear about like kind of, I hate the homogenous, like this kind of thing. So that's, I think on our part, we'd still do the same thing, which is empowering women's voices against him. So.
Can I say, first of all, I respect the fact that Donald Trump is the elected president of the United States. He actually lost the popular vote, but he did win the election under the rules of American elections, and I don't query that at all. But you actually ask a serious question, and it's one, if I can be honest, I've asked myself about, I said before the American election I hoped Hillary Clinton would win, and got a bit of criticism because, it's not the done thing. I've had people on social media criticising me this week because I've spoken out about them. But, you take a step back from that, and across the world and down the ages, human rights abuses, intolerance, prejudice, bigotry prevail because people are scared to speak truth to power. And some things are so fundamental. And what we're dealing with here are pretty fundamental human rights. It matters to us in this country that we don't see the rise of fascism in the United States of America, frankly. And so there are some things where I just don't think diplomatic silence is appropriate. And it's not about not respecting the election result of another country. It's about saying that actually some things do transcend all of that. And I appreciate not everybody will agree with that, but it goes back to what I said earlier on. If you're not prepared to kind of speak from the heart, then fundamentally I don't think you should be in politics.
Mm-hmm. Just a brief addition. I think it's also important to make a distinction between the politicians we criticize or the populist demagogues in many parts of the world and people. I differentiate those two. In other words, to put it more bluntly, I don't think not everyone who voted for Trump is an Islamophobe. Not everyone who voted for Brexit is necessarily a xenophobe or against Europe or even necessarily against you. We have to see those nuances. I think this is an age in which there's lots of emotions, lots of anger, anxiety, and frankly, I think we need to do a better job in terms of connecting with people's emotions. Unfortunately, populist demagogues are doing a much better job in that field than many liberals and progressives. We need to do a better job from now on. It's understandable that someone might have worries about their child's future or if their job opportunities. Yes, it's understandable. I'm an immigrant myself, but people might be worried about immigration. But we should be able to talk about these issues freely in open spaces. If we suppress those emotions, I'm just worried that we will be pushing people towards the lap of the far right and towards more populist demagoguery. Is there another one?
There's one like right up the back.
Up the back. And here, yeah.
And then there.
Hi, thank you. Can I go? Yeah?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you for such a fascinating panel. I was wondering if you could mention books that have been central to the development of your ideas about feminism and the politics of liberation, because you've all articulated so well the challenges that face women today on a global scale.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Kind of books, books are kind of an integral part of my life, and I have sort of punctuated different stages of my life. I mean, so the kind of writers that influenced me when I was growing up would be true of many women. You know, Doris Lessing, Simone de Beauvoir, Margaret Atwood, who, I mean, if I was you, I would be absolutely beside myself.
Yeah, we are.
You know, today, writers like Ali Smith and Zadie Smith. So, you know, these kind of writers who are expressing, you know, experiences of women, putting female characters to the fore. I have to say, I've become a huge fan of this woman here, and I'm working my way through her back catalogue just now, which I'm not just saying this because she's here. Absolutely fantastic writing. So I think it's really important. You know, if you think back, way back, you know, to a time when women didn't use their own names when they wrote. They tended to often use male pseudonyms. And so for me, books, not just by women's writers, but books have been so important to my development as a human being, let alone as a politician or a feminist.
Yeah, I really liked, I don't know, it's by Rhiannon Lucy Coslett and someone else, Vagenda. I really loved that. It was kind of, I read some things before that was kind of the massive trigger and actual proper reading. Can I do a tangent and shout out to some other books that are slightly non-feministy? Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's a kind of thing in indie publishing just now that people are doing a lot of crowdfunded anthologies to right not the wrongs of mainstream publishing, but there's a lot of like women as a homogenous lump. So we did Nasty Women show that they're not a homogenous lump. And there's a publisher called Dead Ink who are doing the same for like working class people who are doing an anthology called Know Your Place, where working class people can actually talk for themselves. And then there's obviously the likes of The Good Immigrant, that was amazing. But also there's a new book that was just kind of preempted by Picador, being curated by Miriam Khan, which is Muslim women's experiences. And I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in indie presses which kind of go beyond feminism but all kind of have the same kind of mantra and ideas of Nasty Women.
Absolutely. Yeah, and personally for me as well, I was raised by a single mother, and I was very lonely as a child, and I think books were my best friends. They kept me sane, they gave me a sense of continuity, a sense of center in life. But I find it very important that our reading lists be eclectic as possible, to read from diverse sources, to read fiction and non-fiction. I hear lots of men in Turkey, particularly men, and these are professional people, columnists, journalists, analysts, who say, I never read fiction. You know, I read the important stuff. I read history, politics, and it always makes me, you know, feel sad, because what we do in one field, what we learn from one field affects what we do in another field. Knowledge is a big cycle. So philosophy on anything, I don't believe in that distinction between highbrow art and lowbrow literature. Who decides? As long as it speaks to our heart, to our mind, we can read anything and everything. But I think it's very important that our sources be as diverse, as broad as possible.
Here, here.
We have time for one more question. Yes, we promised.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, as a middle-aged chap, but younger than the man down there, I thought it was a very informative, very genuine panel discussion, and from the audience. A couple of things, I've got a couple of points. One is the title of this was Women Under Scrutiny, Women in Public Under Scrutiny, the title of the talk and the brochure. And also, part of it, Nicola said something about women are sometimes their own worst enemies. And at the weekend, you had made a kind of talk where you made a comment about Clark's Dolly Babe shoes. The point that you maybe missed in this is that Clarks have been successful for about 100 years in knowing their market, and they would have researched that brand name to be attractive to some section of women who like that kind of thing. So maybe you could have made more point of that, because. And the second thing is, you said, I think your own favourite shop I read is a shop called Totty Rocks. Now, it's very what I want to know is, how can you be careful to make these right comments and support of women's rights, which I absolutely go along with, because sometimes the part of the argument isn't coming across.
Well, Totty Rocks actually is a design company based in Edinburgh, run by two women, and that's what they've chosen to call themselves. You know, the Clarks thing's interesting, because actually the fact that the girls' shoe was called Dolly Babe is not what really troubled me about it. It was the fact that the boys' shoe was called Leader. And, you know, around occasionally. So I know these things are quite difficult and challenging, and I think for people like me, you've got to watch that you don't just become, or people don't think you're becoming just horribly politically correct. I have no interest in that, but you do have to sometimes challenge these things. My niece is 11 years old, and is in that kind of market, and I don't mind if she wants pink shoes, and because she does, she wants everything pink. But what I do mind is if anywhere in her brain she's getting the message that only boys are leaders. I don't want that to be what she takes away from that. As we said earlier on, words matter, and sometimes they can matter too much. I get that, and sometimes politicians can make it seem as if they matter too much, but they do matter.
Yeah. I think we need to end on that wonderful note, and we will be continuing. We're going to have book signing in the bookshop tent. But thank you so much to all of you.